He bought a flower from a street vendor just to avoid seeming heartless. But that woman used to fill concert halls with music so powerful it brought people to tears. That's the story we're telling today. How a ruthless millionaire crossed paths with a disgraced prodigy on a snowy Manhattan night, and how that single, cold encounter would unravel a chain of secrets buried beneath power, silence, and betrayal. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if you enjoy powerful, emotional stories with twists, heartbreak, and redemption, stick around. Enjoy the story. The snow had already buried most of Manhattan in a heavy silence, muting car horns, softening the edges of buildings, and turning Fifth Avenue into something ghostly and unfamiliar. William Astor, in his long cashmere coat and patent leather shoes, walked quickly, precisely, as though the cold were beneath him. His gait was tight, clipped, each step meant to avoid the icy slush rather than confront it. He moved like a man who had never had to stop for anything in his life. Not traffic, not weather, and certainly not people. As he turned the corner near Central Park West, he saw her. She was barely noticeable at first, a small figure, wrapped in layers of mismatched wool, with a battered wooden crate beside her filled with flowers. Roses mostly. Somehow, even in the dead of winter, there were roses. They looked wrong against the snow, too red, too alive. She wasn't calling out to pedestrians or holding up a sign. She simply stood there, hands tucked into sleeves, eyes alert but not begging. A few petals trembled in the wind. William slowed just slightly, not enough to make it obvious. He looked at her the way he looked at everything unfamiliar, with vague suspicion and detached curiosity. She noticed, of course. People like her always noticed. When he approached, she didn't smile. She didn't flinch. Her posture was straight, chin high, gaze level. For a moment, they just looked at each other, two people from completely different planets trapped in the same frozen evening. That he reached into his coat pocket and produced a $50 bill, crisp and dry despite the snow. He plucked a single red rose from her crate, held it like it might stain his gloves, and dropped the bill into the chipped ceramic bowl at her feet. His tone was clipped, edged with the kind of condescension that had made him feared in boardrooms and courtrooms alike. Even cheap flowers manage to survive the winter, he said, his voice low and sharp. More than I can say for most things. It wasn't the kind of insult meant to provoke a reaction. It was a dismissal, an end note, the kind of comment that left no space for response. And yet, she didn't blink. She didn't smile or lower her gaze. She met his eyes, held them, and then, without a single word, offered a nod. Not one of thanks, but of recognition. A gesture that said, I see you. I understand you. You're not as unreadable as you think. For reasons he wouldn't understand until much later, William hesitated before walking away. He didn't look back, he never did, but something in her silence lingered. It followed him back to his penthouse, through the revolving doors of buildings named after his family, up to the glass tower where he ruled without question. It gnawed at the back of his mind while he reviewed reports, while he watched the markets. That silence had weight. 2 days later, he was at a gala he didn't want to attend. A charity fundraiser for the arts. One of those events where wealthy people pretend to care about culture for an hour and then write checks big enough to forget it. He flipped through the program absent-mindedly between hors d'oeuvres and strained conversations, his mind elsewhere. And then, just before the third musical act, he saw her name. Eliza Moore, piano. He stared at the faded typeface like it might vanish. But there it was. He looked up, scanned the crowd, but didn't see her. The act had long since passed. She must have performed before he even arrived. A wave of something unfamiliar passed. Through him, regret, disbelief, curiosity with an edge of guilt. He asked a few questions, casually, discreetly. No one raised an eyebrow. She'd been a student at Juilliard once. Gifted, praised, played at Carnegie Hall before she was 23. Then, nothing. A whisper of scandal, something vague about misconduct, about a sponsor pulling out. No one really remembered. The kind of mystery the elite quickly forget unless it affects their portfolios. That night, back in his office, William sat without working. He poured a drink he didn't taste and stared out at the snow swirling past his window. That woman selling flowers had once stood on stages lit with gold, playing music people paid thousands to hear. Now she stood on a corner in silence, letting her fingers go numb while people ignored her. He didn't know what compelled him to look deeper. It wasn't guilt. Guilt was for people who cared. It wasn't pity either. It was the discomfort of not knowing, of being caught off guard. And William Astor hated not knowing. William Astor wasn't used to being haunted by things he didn't understand. His world was defined by control, financial markets, power dinners, sealed boardroom deals. Yet for days after the gala, the name Eliza Moore continued to pull at his thoughts like a splinter he couldn't remove. He couldn't reconcile the image of the flower seller wrapped in secondhand wool with the program listing a Juilliard prodigy. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It had transformed into an itch, a growing awareness that something had been stolen, not from him, but from someone who never had the means to fight back. He began his investigation with the cold efficiency of a businessman conducting due diligence on a failing company. No emotion, no assumptions, just facts. He requested access to Juilliard archives through an old donor connection, scanned through performance reviews, academic accolades, and recordings. The evidence was undeniable. Eliza Moore wasn't just talented. She had been celebrated, considered one of the rare modern interpreters of Chopin and Schubert with a soul well beyond her age. She had received standing ovations at international recitals, invitations to record with orchestras in Europe, and glowing articles in elite music journals. But then the timeline broke. Around her 25th birthday, the press stopped. Contracts were voided. Her name fell out of circulation. No announcement, no scandalous headline, just absence. That kind of disappearance didn't happen by accident, not at that level. William knew what silence meant in his world. It was always orchestrated and always had a motive that he looked deeper. Through discreet contacts in media and legal circles, he uncovered sealed arbitration records, character defamation suits that had been withdrawn, anonymous smear pieces about her personal behavior, rumors of financial misconduct that didn't hold up under scrutiny. The pattern was clear. Someone had worked very hard to ruin Eliza's career and had done it with enough influence to make it permanent. What troubled William wasn't just the ruthlessness. It was the familiarity of the methods. There was a signature in that kind of destruction, and it reeked of the Astor playbook. His suspicions narrowed to one name: Charles Astor, his older brother. Charles had spent years as the face of the family empire, the so-called moral center, the philanthropic heir with a shining reputation and a ruthless streak carefully hidden behind tailored suits and handshakes. He had the power, the legal team, and the motivations. William remembered vaguely how Charles once pulled funding from a musical foundation citing ethical concerns. That same foundation had once sponsored Eliza. The connection felt too close. William knew he needed proof before even considering confronting his brother. He spent nights combing through financial ledgers, emails, and encrypted messages retrieved through private investigators. Eventually, the truth took form. Payments disguised as consulting fees to media outlets. Legal threats sent to venues that dared book her. Internal memos with Charles's initials approving reputational damage control operations. It wasn't just a hunch now, it was a damning indictment. Charles had orchestrated the fall of Eliza Moore with the precision of a hostile takeover, and William had stood by, oblivious, complicit by silence. The realization shook him harder than he expected, not because he hadn't known what his family was capable of, but because, for once, the victim had a face. Not a number, not a competitor. A face. A woman who met his eyes in the snow without flinching. A woman who had once poured her soul into music and now survived on spare change. That disconnect crawled under his skin. The weight of it pressed into his ribs until he couldn't breathe without tasting bitterness. He didn't wait for the next family gathering to act. Instead, he invited Charles to dinner at one of their private clubs, a quiet place with walls thick enough to swallow secrets. It was the kind of venue where power was maintained over cigars and rare wine. Charles arrived smiling, unaware, slipping into the leather booth with the grace of someone who had never been told no. William didn't offer a greeting. He dropped a thin folder onto the table between them, the pages inside arranged in order: financial records, memos, screenshots, legal letters, all carefully labeled and dated. Charles's smile faltered for only a second before he leaned back, his hands folded calmly. "And what exactly are you accusing me of?" he asked, voice smooth, unaffected. William didn't raise his voice. He didn't deliver a dramatic speech. He simply met his brother's eyes and said, "You destroyed her because she wouldn't play by your rules. Because she refused to become a symbol for your charity projects. Because she had dignity." Charles scoffed. "She was unstable. A risk. I protected the brand. You of all people should understand that." But William didn't flinch. He had made up his mind. The table between them felt like a courtroom, and the silence was heavier than any jury. There was no shouting, no glass broken in anger. Just two brothers locked in a battle of wills, with history pressing down between them. Charles issued his final threat with a shrug. "If you push this, you'll bring the family down with her. Think very carefully before you trade legacy for justice." But William had already thought it through. For the first time in years, he saw through the lies that built their empire. And he couldn't unsee it. When he stood up, leaving the folder behind, he wasn't just walking away from dinner. He was walking away from the Astor machine. And Charles knew it. The fallout from that dinner didn't take long to surface. William didn't return to the office the next morning. Instead, he sat in his study surrounded by decades of curated family memorabilia, photos of Astor men shaking hands with presidents, headlines praising billion-dollar mergers, charity plaques with Charles's name etched in gold. None of it looked noble anymore. The shine had dulled. The smiles now carried a shadow of calculated deception. William opened the encrypted drive he had compiled, copied the evidence, and sent it to 3 places: the district attorney's office, the financial ethics board, and the private legal firm he'd retained the moment he suspected Charles's involvement. Then, with quiet resolve, he drafted a resignation letter from every board and trust that bore his name, including the Astor Foundation. No press release, no explanations, just signatures and silence. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was a clean cut. The media frenzy was inevitable. By nightfall, tabloids splashed with vague headlines speculating about a power rift between the Astor brothers. Financial networks questioned William's mental health, suggesting a breakdown, a midlife crisis, anything but the truth. Pundits scrambled for narratives, and shareholders panicked. Astor Industries' stock dipped overnight. Inside the empire, there was chaos. Executives whispered, lawyers prepped for damage control, and Charles, predictably, spun lies in closed-door meetings. William didn't answer calls. He didn't issue statements. His silence became its own kind of power, unsettling in its finality. And yet, beneath the chaos, something else stirred in William. Not relief, exactly, but a strange clarity. The fog that had once clouded his judgments, that convenient numbness, built from years of luxury and insulation, had finally burned away. In its place was a single thread of purpose: repair the damage done, not through spectacle or self-pity, but through direct action. That he found Eliza again, not at her usual spot, but outside a tiny church on the Lower East Side, where she sometimes left flowers at the steps. She saw him approach and didn't move. Her expression was unreadable, not afraid, not angry, just waiting. He didn't waste words trying to explain everything. He simply said, "I need you to have something," and handed her a photo, an image of a piano. Not just any piano, a vintage Steinway, battered and aged, once belonging to one of William's few true mentors, a man who taught him discipline when his world was made only of excess. It had sat untouched in storage for years. "It's yours if you want it," he added, his voice quieter now, stripped of the arrogance that had once marked it. No conditions, no press, just what it should have been. Eliza didn't take the photo immediately. Her fingers trembled as they hovered over it. She stared at him, eyes narrowed, as though trying to measure what he wasn't saying. When she finally took it, it was with the same quiet resolve she'd shown that first night. No thank you, no forgiveness. Just the beginning of something wordless and strange. Something neither of them yet understood. 2 days later, William delivered the piano himself. He helped carry it up 3 narrow flights into a walk-up apartment owned by a retired musician, who offered space in exchange for the promise of music returning to his home. William didn't speak much during the delivery. He simply stayed until it was in place, wiped his hands, and stepped back. Eliza sat at the bench, her spine rigid, her fingers still unsure. Then she played a single note, C, soft and hesitant, like testing the air after a storm. She didn't look at him as she played. and he didn't speak. The music was uncertain at first, like memory clawing its way out of long-forgotten corners. Then, slowly, it filled the room with warmth. Notes stretching, recovering, rebuilding. William felt something in his chest tighten, not in pain, but in recognition. He left before the final note, not to escape, but because he knew that moment belonged only to her. In the weeks that followed, Eliza began playing again. Small performances at local community centers, charity events, forgotten. Recital halls. There were no critics, no photographers, no press releases. Just people, quietly moved by a sound they hadn't expected to need. William attended a few performances from the back row, never introducing himself. He watched as Eliza regained something far more precious than fame: peace, control, dignity. Every note she played was a reclaiming of her identity, an act of quiet rebellion against everything that had tried to erase her. One night, after a performance in a dimly lit art space, she found him waiting outside. She didn't thank him, and he didn't expect it. Instead, she asked, "Why did you really help me?" William didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "Because you were the only honest thing I'd seen in a long time." That answer, raw and unfiltered, hung in the cold night air. Eliza didn't respond. She simply nodded once, and they walked together in silence, two lives, tangled by injustice, now moving cautiously towards something neither dared name. The quiet of William's office, now emptied of staff and stripped of corporate polish, had a different sound than before, no longer the hum of power but the echo of reckoning. He stood alone among the remnants of a life built on control, staring at portraits of Astor men arranged like a lineage of emperors. Each frame told a story of conquest, not kindness. His name still held weight on documents and deeds across Manhattan, but inside, something fundamental had changed. The silence he had once feared had become a refuge. The world outside wanted explanations, retractions, statements to mend the cracks now spreading through Astor Industries. But William ignored the storm. What mattered could no longer be spoken. Into headlines, he turned his focus inward, combing through records not to save his reputation, but to hand over every truth he had once protected. His attorneys warned him, tried to delay the release of certain files, but William was unmoved. He delivered each folder to authorities, accompanied by a single message: do what must be done. There was no press conference, no strategic leak. Only the facts, methodically and ruthlessly documented, implicating Charles and a web of collaborators in years of fraudulent practices, coercion, and targeted sabotage. It wasn't a hero's gesture. It was restitution. One man dismantling the very fortress he'd once guarded. The response was immediate. Charles was summoned for questioning, and panic spread through the upper floors of the Astor financial empire. Board members scrambled to distance themselves. Publicists shifted into overdrive, and investors pulled out in waves. William's name, once a symbol of infallible judgment, was now associated with collapse, but he didn't care. For the first time, he could look in the mirror without calculation. The family legacy was burning, and it had to. While Manhattan buzzed with the fallout, William did not retreat. He moved through the days without entourage or agenda, living simply, quietly. He refused interviews and declined offers from rival firms hungry to claim the story of his redemption. He understood that nothing about this was noble, it was merely necessary. He spent long evenings walking the quieter blocks of the city, reflecting not on what had been lost, but on what could still be salvaged. The ghosts of his choices no longer whispered accusations. They now offered questions. What will you do with what remains? Eliza had kept her distance after their last conversation, but her music lingered in his thoughts. He would sometimes sit outside the halls where she performed, never entering, just listening. The notes carried something different now, not just skill, but something bruised and brave. It was a reminder that healing wasn't linear and justice didn't always roar. Sometimes it played softly, letting wounds close on their own terms. 1 afternoon, a letter arrived. Handwritten. No return address, but he knew the penmanship. Eliza's words were few but clear. You did something impossible. Now stop watching from the shadows. Either be present or leave me to live. It wasn't a threat. It was a boundary, a line drawn in quiet strength. William read it 3 times before folding it carefully and placing it in his jacket, he found her at a small community recital in Brooklyn, performing for a modest crowd seated on folding chairs. No press, no stage lighting, just music and people who needed it. After the performance, as attendees filed out, he approached. She didn't look surprised, nor did she smile. He didn't bring flowers, didn't attempt small talk. Instead, he said, "I'm not here to take anything. I only want to understand what it means to rebuild the right way." For the first time, Eliza's expression softened. Then stop thinking of it as rebuilding. Just be better. From now on. From that moment, a new kind of companionship began. It was not romantic, not yet. It was based on a mutual understanding forged through silence and scars. William helped, where she allowed, setting up equipment, organizing recitals, connecting her discreetly with trusted names in the arts who owed him quiet favors. He never asked for credit. She never offered forgiveness. They simply moved forward, like two people who had outlived a war and chose to walk the same road. Even if still unsure of the destination, the legal proceedings against Charles intensified. William was called to testify. He arrived without fanfare, submitted evidence calmly, and answered every question without embellishment. He didn't dramatize, didn't seek sympathy. He stated facts, acknowledged failures, and admitted complicity. By silence. The court wasn't moved by emotion. It didn't need to be. The truth spoke loud enough. By the time he stepped off the stand, there was no applause, no vindication, just the quiet closure of a man who had finally chosen the harder right over the easier wrong. That night, he didn't go home. He returned to the place it had all begun, the corner where Eliza once stood selling roses in the snow. It was spring now, and the spot was empty, the city thawing under soft lights and quieter winds. He stood there for a while, watching strangers pass, unaware of the silent revolution that had taken place. When he finally walked away, he did so not as an Astor, not as a former mogul, but as a man finally at peace with the truth. William didn't expect redemption, but he hoped for presence. In the quiet aftermath of his testimony and the continued unraveling of his family's empire, he found himself moving through the city with a kind of intention that had nothing to do with power. His days were no longer scheduled in 15-minute increments or centered on influence. Now, his efforts were small and specific, deliberate gestures made with no audience. He found himself drawn more and more to Eliza's world. Though he remained careful not to cross lines she hadn't invited him to. He never asked her for updates on the case or spoke of Charles again. Instead, he listened when she shared fragments of her day or when she fell into silence and let the moment speak for her. Their connection had no name, no definition. It lived in pauses and gestures, in the way William would arrive early to help, carry chairs into a recital room, or how Eliza would set aside a second cup of tea without asking if he was staying. These were not grand overtures. They were pieces of a foundation slowly rebuilt, not on guilt or restitution, but on respect. The Steinway, restored now and full of its old voice, sat in the corner of her shared practice space like a witness to this evolution. She played it not for him, but he heard it often, and each time, the music cut deeper, not in pain, but in something closer to release. Then came the evening that changed something fundamental between them. A local arts center in Harlem, known for its resilience during the city's hardest decades, invited Eliza to perform as part of a cultural series honoring women whose lives had been rewritten by injustice. It wasn't prestige. It wasn't about exposure. It was an invitation that carried weight precisely because it came from a community that understood survival. Eliza accepted, but hesitated to ask William for help organizing. She didn't want to blur the fragile space they had cultivated. But before she could decide, he volunteered, quietly, precisely, not as a benefactor, just someone who understood what needed to be done. The night of the recital, the hall was modest but filled. Elders sat beside schoolchildren. Locals came, not for a name, but for the music. William didn't wear a suit. He greeted volunteers, moved chairs, ran extension cords for stage lights that flickered at the wrong time. When Eliza appeared, dressed simply but with a calm authority that hadn't been there before, the room shifted. There was no announcement. She sat, breathed, and began. Her fingers moved with purpose, unhurried but certain. The music didn't beg for attention, it commanded it through vulnerability. Pieces she had once played with youthful precision now carried the grit of a soul tempered by loss. Chopin's Nocturne turned into something mournful and triumphant all at once. When she finished, the silence that followed was heavier than applause. It was a silence of people absorbing something personal, intimate. Then, the clapping came, not polite, but heartfelt. Afterward, as people approached to thank her, Eliza searched the crowd. William stood by the exit, arms crossed, head slightly bowed. She walked to him, not smiling, just present. "You didn't try to take this moment," she said. He nodded. "It was never mine to take." She paused, then added, "Thank you for understanding that." Something subtle shifted between them. Not romance, not yet, but a soft collapsing of walls. The next day, she invited him to walk with her, not in the city, but north, along the edge of the Hudson, away from noise. They didn't talk much, but when they did, it was about music, not business. She shared pieces she wanted to write, but had been too afraid to begin. He spoke of things he might create, not as an Astor, but as a man no longer bound by that identity. There were still edges to their connection, scars too fresh to forget, but the path between them was now honest. Later that week, William gave her a small envelope, not cash, not a contract, but a note with a name and number. "A foundation director in Vermont," he explained. "They run music residencies, no media, just solitude and space to compose. I didn't ask them for anything, just told them they might be lucky if they heard from you." Eliza took it, nodded, and said nothing. But the next day, she called the number. William didn't go with her when she left for Vermont a few days later. She hadn't invited him, and he hadn't asked. She needed space, but she sent him a letter from the train. "I'm not escaping. I'm choosing myself this time. Thank you for not standing in the way. Let's see what grows when there's room to breathe." It wasn't closure, it was continuation. And for the first time, William didn't fear the silence between them. He knew it was the sound of something real taking root. The months passed in quiet intervals, marked not by headlines or shareholder meetings, but by handwritten letters and rare phone calls between two people learning how to live outside the lives they once knew. William adjusted to a new pace, no longer tethered to the rhythms of high finance. He now spent his mornings at local libraries, reading books he once dismissed as impractical, and his afternoons volunteering with an arts initiative that repaired old instruments for public schools. He spoke little of his past. Those who recognized him rarely asked. His presence was now rooted in action, not status, and that was exactly what he needed. Eliza, far from the city's noise, immersed herself in a rhythm of her own. The residency in Vermont offered her more than space. It gave her silence that nourished instead of punished. She wrote music not for performance, but for exploration, rediscovering sounds she had abandoned when survival became her only focus. Her compositions were unpolished but honest, echoing forests, rain, memories she had buried beneath years of shame. Occasionally, she sent William short recordings, raw piano takes captured on her phone, full of pauses and imperfection. He listened to them at night, alone, and never responded with critique. He simply replied, "I heard it." By the time spring touched the edges of Manhattan again, they had begun to orbit each other more deliberately. When Eliza returned from Vermont, she didn't announce it. She arrived in the city quietly, rented a modest studio near Washington Square, and resumed her slow return to the stage. But it wasn't the same stage she once chased. Now, she performed in places where stories mattered more than ticket prices: community spaces, cultural centers, churches that hadn't seen a piano played in years. Her presence was never advertised. People came because they remembered, and those who didn't came back because the music stayed with them. William never sat in the front. He always stood near the exits, hands in pockets, watching with the same stillness he had first used to dismiss her. Now it was reverence. He understood what each performance cost her, not financially, but emotionally. The trust required to share beauty after betrayal was immense, and he honored it by never intruding. He didn't ask questions when she disappeared between shows, didn't press when she canceled meetings. Their bond remained unspoken, a thread pulled tighter with each passing moment of shared quiet. One evening, after a small concert in an aging Polish cultural hall, Eliza walked toward him with a folder in hand. "I wrote something," she said. "Not for a hall, not even for me, Really? For you. William took the folder, carefully opening it to reveal sheet music handwritten in neat, deliberate strokes. The title read simply, Reconstruction. No dedication, no date. He looked up, his expression unreadable. She continued, It's not about fixing the past. It's about living with what came after. He nodded, unable to find words worthy of the moment. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat at his old piano, the one piece of his former life he hadn't sold or given away, and played through the composition slowly, each note a lesson in restraint and memory. Around the same time, the final stages of Charles's trial were unfolding. The courtroom was smaller than anyone expected. No media blitz, no public statement from the Astor family. Just a judge, a few lawyers, and the man who once ruled half the city's real estate with quiet brutality now answering for the choices made in silence. William attended each day without fail, offering no commentary, sitting alone. The evidence he had helped gather was damning. Emails, phone calls, falsified records, anonymous payouts. But the verdict, when it came, was still a moment of gravity. Charles was sentenced to 5 years, with the possibility of parole. No outburst, no protest, just a nod, and then handcuffs. After the hearing, reporters tried to chase William down, begging for statements. He didn't break stride. He walked past the microphones, past the cameras, down the marble courthouse steps, and into the street. A man unburdened. That night, he returned to the old recital hall where Eliza had first played again after the scandal. It was empty now, closed for renovations. He stood outside for a long time, then left a single flower at the door. No note, just a symbol that only 2 people would understand. Weeks later, Eliza invited him to a private showing, her first full concert since everything fell apart. No one else was invited. She played not on a stage, but in the chapel of a former monastery. Its acoustics still intact, its pews faded and cracked. William sat in the center pew, alone. She walked in, nodded once, and began. The music was not polished. It stumbled in places, but it was real. And in that still chapel, under the dim light of forgotten stained glass, William Astor cried for the first time in 30 years, not from guilt, not from grief, but from the indescribable recognition that he had finally done something true. The sentencing of Charles Astor sent ripples through the city's elite, not because of its severity, but because it happened at all. For decades, the Astor family had existed above consequence, sealed behind lawyers and legacy. But now, in the quiet of a courtroom stripped of ceremony, the name had been dragged into the light and measured against the very justice it had once manipulated. William watched it unfold without flinching. He didn't savor his brother's downfall, nor did he pity him. He simply recognized it as inevitable, a culmination of choices made in arrogance, greed, and the cold dismissal of others as obstacles. What struck him most was not the sentence, but Charles's face as the judge. Read the verdict. The defiance was gone, replaced by a hollow resignation that mirrored the man William had become before Eliza re-entered his life. In the weeks that followed, the media attempted to revive interest in the Astor scandal, but the public had moved on. There were no protests, no rallies, just whispers in upper circles and a slow rebranding of institutions that had once boasted the Astor name. William received invitations to speak, to write memoirs, to appear on late-night programs as the Astor who turned against his own. He declined every offer. The story didn't belong to him anymore. His role had ended with the truth. What came next wasn't about him. It was about Eliza, and about what would survive after justice had run its course. Eliza, meanwhile, had begun composing again with purpose. Her music shifted from reflection to assertion, melodies with spine and intent. She performed with more regularity, but never under spotlights. Her concerts remained intimate, word-of-mouth affairs where the music spoke louder than any promotional campaign. Audiences didn't just listen, they leaned forward, drawn by the undercurrent of defiance wrapped in beauty. And at nearly every performance, somewhere in the shadows, William sat, always observing, never intruding, content to be the quiet witness to the life he had once contributed to silencing. One evening, after a small concert in Queens, she approached him with a new composition. "This is the last one from that chapter," she said, handing him a notebook. The rest will be new." He understood what she meant. The music she had written so far had been catharsis, necessary but heavy. What came next would be created not from pain, but from possibility. That shift, subtle but profound, marked the true end of her exile. Soon after, William received a letter from the Department of Justice. It was a formal notice confirming that the investigation into Charles's network had closed. The evidence provided had been critical in securing multiple convictions. They thanked him for his cooperation, acknowledged the personal and professional risks he had taken, and informed him that he was free from further obligation. He read the letter twice, folded it, and placed it in a drawer he no longer used. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was earned out a few days later. William returned to the building where Eliza once sold flowers. The corner was now part of a pedestrian plaza, clean and renovated, but he recognized the cracks in the sidewalk. He stood there for a moment, recalling the disdain in his voice the day they met, the bitterness he had wielded like armor. He realized something then. Redemption was never loud. It didn't arrive in applause or articles. It came in small recognitions, in standing still where one used to walk past without seeing. He left a single white rose at the base of the lamppost and walked away, not as a man haunted, but as one who had learned how to carry what he couldn't erase. The following week, Eliza invited him to a private recital, not as a favor or a gesture, but as a shared moment. This time, the audience was only 5 people: musicians, friends, and one child learning piano from a school that had received donated instruments through William's foundation. The room was quiet, not reverent but warm. She played not to impress, but to connect, her music now light where it had once been heavy. When she finished, there were no formal bows, no standing ovations. Just a breath shared between those present, like something sacred had passed through them. After the others had gone, Eliza approached him. "You were never the villain I feared you'd be," she said, eyes steady. "But you weren't the man I trust now either. That man, you built him, and I'm glad I got to watch it happen." William didn't answer with words. He simply nodded, his chest tight with the kind of emotion he had once trained himself to avoid. In that moment, they stood not as redeemer and redeemed, but as equals, 2 people who had broken, changed, and continued forward with something more valuable than perfection. Integrity, not inherited, not demanded, chosen, and finally, for the first time, William reached out and took her hand. Not to claim her, not to define the moment, but to honor the distance they had both traveled. The chapel was nearly empty again, as it had been once before, but this time it carried the warmth of intention. Outside, spring had settled into the city without ceremony. The air was no longer sharp. The wind no longer carried the bite of judgment. Inside, sunlight passed through stained glass, coloring the worn wooden floor with quiet beauty. Eliza sat at the piano alone, her hands resting lightly on the keys, not pressing them, just feeling their coolness, the familiarity that now came without fear. Across the room, William remained in the 3rd pew, silent, his coat folded neatly. Beside him, a journal open but untouched on his lap. No words passed between them. None were needed. This was not a performance. There were no invitations, no programs, no audience to impress. It was simply a moment carved out of time, a ritual shared only between 2 people who had stopped keeping score. She began to play without announcement. The first notes moved slowly, almost like a memory finding its form. It wasn't a piece from any known composer. It was something new, something personal, something composed in solitude and now entrusted to the space between them. William closed his eyes, not out of reverence, but to listen more deeply, to catch every hesitation, every shift in tone. It was not flawless. That was never the point. The music was lived in, shaped by scars and silences, more truthful than any speech he could have delivered. When she finished, the room didn't fill with applause. Only a stillness remained, a sense that something had been acknowledged without needing to be said. Eliza closed the piano lid gently and stood. She didn't walk toward him, and he didn't rise to meet her. They exchanged a glance across the space, and in that look, there was everything. Forgiveness that never needed to be requested, gratitude too complex to be spoken aloud, and the understanding that sometimes the most profound transformations occur quietly, without banners or declarations. That evening, William walked the long route home. taking streets he hadn't in years. Past buildings that once bore his family's name, now occupied by new tenants with no memory of what the Astor name once represented. He passed a bookstore where his father had once bought him a biography of Churchill, and the Italian cafe where he'd closed his first million-dollar deal. The places were unchanged, but his gaze no longer lingered on them. They were simply part of the city now, not trophies, not burdens, just landmarks in someone else's chapter. He returned to his apartment, still sparsely furnished, the walls no longer filled with awards or portraits. The grand space had become humble, not by force, but by choice. In the kitchen, he brewed a pot of tea and sat by the window, watching the dusk settle into the skyline. No emails waited, no meetings loomed, just the stillness of a life he had learned to live without armor. On the table beside him was the envelope Eliza had given him weeks before, sheet music, handwritten, with one page marked by a smudge of ink where her hand must have trembled. He picked it up, looked over the notes again, and smiled faintly. He wouldn't play it tonight, maybe not ever, but just having it there, near him, was enough. In the months that followed, life didn't swell into a new chapter with fanfare. It continued. Eliza traveled again, this time to teach, not perform, small workshops in rural towns where children had never seen a live piano. William visited occasionally, sitting in the back, careful not to shift the balance of her new path. They wrote, often, sometimes about the weather, sometimes about nothing. Their correspondence was spare but sincere, filled with moments instead of narratives. When they saw each other, it was never dramatic. A quiet dinner, a walk by the river, a shared silence under a blooming cherry tree in the park they used to pass without noticing. One afternoon, as the city buzzed with the energy of a summer knot. Yet arrived, William stood again at the corner where their story began. The flower vendor was gone now, replaced by a sleek coffee cart and a busker with a violin. He watched for a while, hands in his pockets, not reminiscing, but simply being present. A little boy asked his mother what the man was playing, and she answered, "It's called a prelude, I think." William smiled, turned, and walked on. The city had moved forward. So had he. The past remained, yes, but it no longer owned him. And that, perhaps, was the truest ending he could have ever earned.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. Your support helps us grow and bring you even more amazing content. See you in the next one.